Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the program. Tonight we're calling it The World Tonight, very appropriately, and going to be covering the latest from the situation in besieged Palestine, and going to be talking about things that are related to that as well. Going to be dipping in our toe into the troubled waters of the Dnieper River, of course, looking at Ukraine, and going to be circling back around to look at the wider picture. The picture being one of imperialism, mainly US imperialism and its bloc in crisis and unsure of what to do. And I'll start by saying that if Hamas was the ragtag terrorist organization that they said it was, and the Americans wouldn't be sending another aircraft carrier battle group, as we covered briefly last night, in the form of the USS Eisenhower to the Eastern Mediterranean, wouldn't be scrambling around to grab as many of its air assets as it possibly could to send into the theatre of operations. And you've got, of course, hysterical, screeching imperialist snakes like the lamentable Lindsey Graham babbling on about the need to secure an immediate war with Iran. And you've got the chaos that is evidently still reigning in the Israeli cabinet about the way forward, and talk of dissent and disorder in the ranks of the Israeli armed forces. They can't equip all of the reservists they've called up properly. There's all kinds of problems apparently related to discipline in the Israeli armed forces. And again, that's nothing new. That's something which has been established in multiple internal Israeli armed forces reports going back over a number of years. So their army is not ready to fight in a close urban environment. No matter how much damage they do through their bombing campaign, their army is apparently plagued by disciplinary problems and motivational and morale problems. So this is not looking particularly good for them. And this might be part of the reason why there has been such a delay so far. We keep getting reports that the Israelis have gone in, only for these to be denied a moment later. And the Israeli war cabinet, though in reality it is a cabinet that is dictated by the United States, it's a group which is under the control now of US imperialism completely, more so than it was already. And they are arguing in and around and amongst themselves as to exactly what they're going to do. They don't know. They're not sure. The imperialists themselves are unsure. They're all agreed that Israel should continue to rack up hundreds of casualties per day via a carpet bombing campaign of the most sadistic kind across Gaza. And, of course, this continues and continues and continues, but they're not moving so far. Now, question is asked then, and it's been asked by many people, well, are they going to move? It looks as if they have to, but a curious thing occurred today, which is that apparently Biden, or Biden's handlers, refused to have him go to Israel and meet with Netanyahu. Now, there could be many different reasons for this. The security men in the Secret Service and the military and the CIA could have told Biden, or Biden's puppet masters, don't do it. The situation is too unsafe. The situation going to Tel Aviv, even though I don't think for a minute that the Palestinian resistance would try and blow up the US president, but it could be that the situation is regarded as too unstable inside Israel itself to risk the personage of the president in going there. Could be that Biden's health is too fragile to make such a trip, even though, of course, he'd be flying in on Air Force One with a squadron filled with the best doctors money could buy. Could also be the fact that they don't want him to be seen next to Netanyahu. Of course, they're happy to put him on the phone, but bear in mind the Democrats have an election coming up, and at least a portion of their own base, even the liberal end, who had previously been supportive of Zionism, do not like Netanyahu. They may still support Israel, but they do not want Netanyahu there, and they certainly don't want to have to defend Biden being pictured next to Netanyahu shaking his hand when Netanyahu is unleashing this mass slaughter in Gaza. So I think there's a number of different reasons in play as to why Biden's handlers have refused to send him over there. I think it's a combination of the fact that the situation inside Israel is regarded as too unstable, because it's not just the Palestinians and other groups that would be regarded as a risk. If I was assessing this on behalf of the intelligence men in Washington, you'd also regard the most out there Israeli settlers, Israeli fascists, as a bit of a risk as well, that the situation in Israel is not stable. And it says a lot that Biden could be sent to Kiev on multiple occasions, but they won't send him to Tel Aviv. It's a very interesting development. Again, multiple reasons likely at play. Biden's health being one of them, the instability inside Israel being probably the most important one, and the rather narrow electoral consideration that the Democrat Party bosses don't want their still presumed candidate for 2024 to be openly seen with Netanyahu, who is despised in wide areas of the Democratic Party voting base, and who they want to get rid of as soon as is practicable. You also got Jeffrey Epstein's old friend, Ehud Barak, coming out and saying today that basically Netanyahu needs to go as soon as possible. So these are all the voices loyal to American imperialism, complete creatures of American imperialism, all saying this guy's got to be disposed of. So this could also be part of the reason why they are unwilling to have Biden seen anywhere near Netanyahu. And of course, the situation around the what we're going to be calling occupied Palestine. I'm going to follow the line of the PFLP in using that descriptor. The situation around occupied Palestine also continues to deteriorate security-wise. You have the ongoing exchange of fire over the Lebanese border between Hezbollah and the Israeli forces. You have a tense situation building up around the Golan Heights in occupied Syria. Now, according to, again, these are reports on Telegram, so we don't know how real this is, but there are reports that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has moved units close to the border with the Golan Heights. So if we pull out our focus here and look at, well, if there is an escalation, how is this going to happen? Because the Iranians apparently have passed a message to the Israelis saying, well, if you begin your ground incursion in Gaza, then we will act against you. So again, how can Iran act against Israel? Well, the reality there is, of course, they don't share any kind of land border or really any kind of sea border. So the only way that they could feasibly go at each other would be through Syria, I would think. Through the Golan Heights being the most promising, perhaps, area for the Iranians to do this. Now, whether they will or not is still another question. But if you're going to make very public threats like this, then you either have to be sure you're capable of following them up, or you are fairly certain that the thing you are threatening about is not going to happen, which is interesting. I mean, I'm fairly sure that the Israelis have to do a ground incursion. Otherwise, this, not just Netanyahu, but everybody associated with this government is fucked. But there is the question of what if they can't agree on how to do it? What if the army is judged to be incapable of fighting? These are all questions which are in the mix at the moment. Now, we may wake up tomorrow and find that the Israelis have sent in the tanks. But, I mean, it has to, even though the Israelis, of course, pounding the table and shouting that they're not afraid of anything, they clearly are. They're clearly afraid of an encounter with Hezbollah. They're clearly afraid of an encounter with the Iranians. That's why there's now going to be, at some point soon, 2 aircraft carriers filled with US air power sat off the coast of Lebanon, though, according to some information that was published today, sat carefully outside of anti-ship missile range. because they apparently are aware of the capabilities that Hezbollah possesses. So here we stand. And so moving back to the escalation point, so assuming then that the Israelis pull a decision together, which at the moment is not guaranteed, there'll be all kinds of rows going back and forth between the US imperialists and people inside the US imperialist bloc as well. Again, for all the bellicose thumping of the table and the screaming of we're with Israel no matter what, there are doubts there, and there are fears of this going very, very wrong. Let's assume then that the US imperialists agree to have the Israelis do some kind of ground incursion to restore the credibility of the Israeli armed forces, which has been severely damaged. Would it be then that they would choose to try and go all the way and conquer the Gaza Strip? All of it? I don't think that even the American imperialists don't want that, because contrary to everything that a lot of people have said about American intelligence over the last year, American intelligence networks still seem to me to actually be capable of gathering accurate information. I mean, I've said this multiple times now, but it's clear to me that the Central Intelligence Agency and the other intelligence agencies in the United States do actually have an accurate assessment of the Russian armed forces, for instance, to go back to the Ukraine example. They knew very well that they didn't want to mix it up with the Russians in January and February of last year. It's why they didn't deploy anybody to Ukraine. It's why they won't do it now, and why they were never going to do it. One, because it's a completely cynical operation that is designed to, as Lindsey Graham says, be the best money we ever spent. Russians are dying and there's no American casualties. At least none they're admitting to. Not officially, anyway. And they were always afraid of the Russian military because they did have an accurate assessment as to its strengths, and they are aware of the weaknesses of the American armed forces and their inabilities, and of course the inability of the imperialist armies to sustain serious casualties, which is why they're using the Ukrainians. Again, we went into this last night, but it's worth reiterating the point. So the Americans do have accurate assessments on the strengths and weaknesses of their enemies. They just don't publicize them. And they don't, of course, give them to the idiot politicians who the machine in Washington wants to make sure are 100% committed to making these decisions. But within the hierarchy, certainly within the military and intelligence hierarchy, they know the assessment of the Russian armed forces. They also know very well the assessment of the capabilities of the Lebanese in the form of Hezbollah, in the form also of the Iranian armed forces. And so they probably know by now fairly well about the capabilities that will meet any Israeli force going into Gaza. Now, they may try to do this with overwhelming force. But again, overwhelming force going into a densely built-up area where everybody who has any credibility as a military expert is saying this is an incredibly bad idea. Well, what exactly are they going to do other than get ambushed and die in large numbers? And also, what if the big American plan to use bunker busters on the Palestinian armed forces tunnel system, what if that doesn't work? Because the American bunker buster bombs have been around for over 30 years. They were using them, I think originally they were designed to try and crack open Soviet bunkers that were dug deep into the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union back in the Cold War. They were using them, of course, to horrible effect in the first Gulf War, where if you're able to remember back that far, I only remember it in retrospect. I remember I've gone back and watched the news footage. They dropped a bunker buster on a civilian air raid shelter in Baghdad, I believe, and killed hundreds of people in there all at once. But the Palestinian resistance have had many, many years to study the effects of and the capabilities of these American bunker buster bombs, and how far they can penetrate and what kind of damage they can do, and they can adjust their military planning accordingly. And so far, they have shown themselves to have a fairly accurate assessment as to the capabilities of the Israeli armed forces. Now, they don't, it seems, at the moment have the ability to shoot down the Israeli aircraft, but they've got everything else, and we can assume that they will have dug as many of their tunnels as possible, as far enough down as possible, to try and negate the impact of what they must have known the Israelis were going to launch, which is the bunker buster bombs. So again, it could be that this is all an exercise in raging, bloody impotence from the Israeli point of view. And in the end, the Iranians don't have to go through with their threat, because if the Israelis do make an incursion, then, and Iran's made this threat openly, then, well, they're going to have to act on it somehow. Quite how, I don't know. I mean, it could be an incursion into the Golan Heights to reconquer that. Whether it'll involve a move from Lebanon by Hezbollah, I mean, I don't claim to know more than I can observe, but my instinct there would be that Hezbollah's role is more defensive than offensive. That if there is to be any kind of offensive by these axis of resistance, as they're called, forces, it will probably come in the Golan Heights and probably be coming from the Iranians. But again, it may be that we don't end up in that position, because, and again, if the Israelis end up doing all this and then either doing nothing or doing a limited incursion, I mean, that's really the end of this government and the end of Netanyahu, which would be, of course, meeting one American tactical objective: the removal of Netanyahu and his clique, and their replacement with some kind of national unity government that excludes all the elements that the Americans want to put back in their box again. So here we are. The imperialists are extracting a bloody and brutal toll. Again, I must emphasize this point, and I will say it every single time I come to talk about this question. It's because it must be re-emphasized. This is a war led by American imperialism. The Israelis are doing the fighting, just as the Banderists and their dragooned, whipped soldiers in Ukraine are doing the fighting there. But it's the US imperialists making all the decisions, paying all the bills, and supplying all the weaponry. It happens because it is in their interest that it happens. And so any war that breaks out more widely must be seen as the creation of American imperialism. And it is here, of course, that I will turn to a more theoretical point of view and advise that I'm going to make an urgent change to the reading group schedule. We're going to start this program with a look at like the Western canon classics, but as the situation politically has changed, and as I started reading again Frantz Fanon's work, Wretched of the Earth, I've decided that though studying the Western canon is unbelievably important, I think for this month, at the very least, I've got to devote time to a special study of Wretched of the Earth, because even just leafing through the opening pages from Sartre, written all the way back in 1961. Now, of course, 1961 is the infamous time just after the defeat, or the coming defeat, of the French imperialists in Algeria, and that very much is reflected in Sartre's text, and also the time where the Algerians were under siege in France itself from people like Maurice Papon. And of course 1961 is also the year that there was a massacre of over 100 Algerians who were, or as many perhaps as 300, who were then dumped in the River Seine by Maurice Papon, the fascist, who was the head of the Paris police at the time. Now, I think it's vital to go back to this, because I was looking over an awful article, as they are all awful articles, in Compact magazine the other day from this guy Schellenberger, Jeff Schellenberger, and he was saying how now, well, we need to take seriously the study of Wretched of the Earth, and he was hinting that it should be regarded as a threat, and for once I agree. The Wretched of the Earth should be regarded by the imperialists as a threatening book, not something for playtime revolutionaries to pretend they're being radical by decolonizing a shared space inside a university faculty. It should be regarded as a revolutionary work. And so for that reason, I intend to devote a significant amount of time to studying that and talking about it in various broadcasts in the upcoming month, because it's a serious work from one of the most significant revolutionary thinkers in the 20th century, I think. I mean, not of the level perhaps of a Lenin or a Mao or a Stalin, but serious and important as well. So Spreadsheet of the Earth is going to be our study for this month. Keep an eye out for that. And even just, as I say, leafing through the opening introduction from Sartre, I want to read for you just the opening couple of paragraphs, because it really does show us that the situation hasn't actually changed all that much in the last 62 years since Sartre wrote that. And so I'll read just the opening paragraph and see if anything in this sounds familiar. Not so very long ago, the Earth numbered 2,000 million inhabitants, 500 million men, and 1,500 million natives. The former had the world, the others had the use of it. Between the two were hired kinglets, overlords, and a bourgeoisie, sham from beginning to end, which served as go-betweens. In the colonies the truth stood naked, but the citizens of the mother country preferred it with clothes on. The native had to love them, something in the way mothers are loved. The European elite undertook to manufacture a native elite. They picked out promising adolescents. They branded them, as with a red-hot iron, with the principles of Western culture. They stuffed their mouths full with high-sounding phrases, grand glutinous words that stuck to their teeth. After a short stay in the mother country, they were sent home, whitewashed. These walking lies had nothing left to say to their brothers. They only echoed from Paris, from London, from Amsterdam. We would utter the words Parthenon, brotherhood, and somewhere in Africa or Asia, lips would open, Phanon, the hood. It was the golden age. It came to an end. The mouths opened by themselves. The yellow and black voices still spoke of our humanism, but only to reproach us with our inhumanity. We listened without displeasure to these polite statements of resentment, at first with proud amazement. What? They are able to talk by themselves? Just look at what we have made of them. We did not doubt that they would accept our ideals, since they accused us of not being faithful to them. Then indeed Europe should believe in her mission. She had Hellenized the Asians. She had created a new breed, the Greco-Latin Negroes. We might add, quite between ourselves as men of the world, after all, let them bawl their heads off. It relieves their feelings. Dogs that bark don't bite. A new generation came on the scene, which changed the issue. With unbelievable patience, its writers and poets tried to explain to us that our values and the true facts of their lives did not hang together, and that they could neither reject them completely nor yet assimilate them. By and large, what they were saying was this: you are making us into monstrosities. Your humanism claims we are at one with the rest of humanity, but your racist methods set us apart. Very much at our ease, we listen to them all. Colonial administrators are not paid to read Hegel. For that matter, they do not read much of him. But they do not need a philosopher to tell them that uneasy consciences are caught up in their own contradictions. They will not get anywhere, so let us perpetuate their discomfort. Nothing will come of it but talk. If they were, the experts told us, asking for anything at all precise in their wailing, it would be integration. Of course, there is no question of granting that. The system which depends on over-exploitation, as you know, would be ruined. But it's enough to hold the carrot in front of their noses. They'll gallop all right. As to revolt, we need not worry at all. What native in his senses would go off to massacre the fair sons of Europe, simply to become European as they are? In short, we encouraged these disconsolate spirits, and thought it not a bad idea for once to award the Prix Goncourt to a Negro. That was before 1939. Now, it goes on in that fashion in Sartre's somewhat purple prose, shall we say, for quite some time. But the point I wanted to make here was that in that 1961 opening there, you can see many of the things that we've come to be talking about on this program. You can see the reflections of colour revolutions, the picking out of a tame bourgeoisie, the training of an intellectual elite to go home and be alien to their own nations and be beholden to the systems put in place, maybe not by Amsterdam these days, but certainly by Washington and London. And that is, of course, what they had in mind for the Palestinians. They had in mind that they were going to train up a comprador elite in the language of human rights and democracy, send them off to rule over what many have described as the Bantustans of the West Bank, that would get smaller every year as the Israelis squeezed the life out of them. And then, of course, they could keep them bribed and in place, because, of course, that is what Obama and then Trump and then Biden have tried to do. They have tried at every turn to make sure that the paid servants of American imperialism in the form of the Abbas government and the Palestinian administration have stayed in place, and they have tried to, of course, bribe their way to Israel's so-called security, and it has all failed. The Palestinian masses come to reject the completely corrupt and compromised local compradors, and it's only going to be a matter of time now if Mahmoud Abbas makes it look as if he's in any way siding with the Netanyahu regime, or whoever comes after Netanyahu, that he will be driven out of office or driven out of power pretty soon as well. I do wonder just how long Fatah can hang on in the West Bank. It seems that their hold is fraying all the time, and yet they are still there. Perhaps it's because Abbas has no real relevance, but it seems that he does have power because his security forces keep honouring his bargain with the Israelis and locking up people and even sometimes killing other Palestinians on behalf of the Israeli regime. So where that goes, we need to, well, clearly keep an eye on that. But to return to the question of, well, how this is going down, and to relate back to Sartre's writing now, Sartre mentions in the latter part of his introduction that the violence imposed by the settlers, and he's mainly talking about the French war in Algeria and the effect that that had on French society. It caused such chaos inside France, the Algerian war, that of course in 1958 de Gaulle came back to power in what was in effect a military coup. So the Fourth Republic, which existed very briefly between 1945 and 1958 in France, was brought to an end by a military coup staged by the French parachutist elite units that were doing most of the fighting, or a lot of the fighting, in Algeria, led by a guy, well, the most prominent of them was a guy called Jacques Massou. And they brought in de Gaulle because the crisis in French society had reached the point where they were at near civil war levels in France. It was getting towards that, or so they thought, given that there was a lot of opposition to the war, and the French reactionaries were lashing out at the Algerians, committing horrendous massacres inside Algeria for many, many years. I believe it was around 1 million Algerians that ended up dying in the War of Independence that raged from the end of World War II all the way up to 1961. And also, of course, this horrendous war that was waged in vain by French imperialism destabilized their own country to the point where, as I said, they had to have a military coup to try and shore things up. They bring back the national hero of World War II, and he promises that he's going to keep Algeria French, l'Algérie française, as they say. But, of course, he's unable to. And de Gaulle, being not insane, and able to rationally assess the capabilities of French imperialism in a way that his brethren officers were not, took a look at Algeria and realized that they were done. They could continue the war, but it would not only lead to a military defeat, but it ran the risk of destabilizing France anyway. So, of course, he agrees to negotiations, thus triggering the long rebellion of the secret army organization, the OAS, who tried to assassinate him on several occasions because they quite rightly from their perspective, felt like they'd brought this guy back into power and he had betrayed them. He had sold them out. Algeria was gone, and they considered Algeria part of France. So, of course, it was never actually part of France. As Sartre points at in his introduction there, the talk of Algeria being a department of France or several departments of France was all a lie. I mean, the settlers had the rights of French citizens. The natives, so to speak, were always treated like dirt. And this is true in, of course, all the colonized nations. They could never treat the native as an equal, and were never prepared to. They had to be available for hyper-exploitation in a way that even the most exploited parts of the French working class were not. So all of the lies that European colonialism told didn't work in the end. The revolts came anyway. Now we must extend the question, which is just how damaging would it be for American imperialism if the Palestinian War of National Liberation were to succeed, if not now, even if assuming that the Israelis operating under the command of US imperialism managed to crush this latest stage in the revolt. Well, the damage that has been done is enormous, and the problems and antagonisms inside Israeli society that it has revealed are enormous. And it will only lead to further risings and further problems that American imperialism will be unable to solve. And so what effect will this have? And also this points us back to why it is that there is such a clearly fanatical attachment to the project that is Israel. Now, I've talked before about how this is, of course, a project started by British imperialism, utilizing Zionism, which is, I will insist again, a ultra-reactionary project of certain members of the European Jewish bourgeoisie back in the 1900s, and is profoundly anti-Jewish. I mean, somebody pointed out in the Telegram group earlier, raising the question of why it is you've got these IDF men coating their bullets in pig grease to shoot at the Palestinians, who are, of course, mostly Muslims, but not all Muslims. There is, of course, a sizable percentage of them that are Christians. But it does rather raise the issue that pork and pork-related products are not kosher. I used to work in a sweet factory for a few months when I was a teenager, and every last Friday in the month there would be the order for Israel would be done. And there would be a rabbi who came in, I think he was attached to the Israeli consulate or something, and he would watch me make these particular batches of mixture for sweets up to make sure that I wasn't contaminating it with anything that was non-kosher. And if he was convinced, he'd put a small K on the corner of each plastic bag as I folded in the mixture of corn flour, sugar, stearic acid and tartaric acid. Lovely combination. It makes something called love hearts, which you may have seen in your part of the world. Because where I grew up it's very famous for having the factory called Swizzle's Matlow at it. And everybody who grew up in my hometown worked in that factory at some point. All the men did anyway. It's still there to this day. It exports all over the world. Point is that anybody who's religious in the slightest, any religious Jews you've run into, and I've run into a few over the years, won't eat pork. Won't handle it either. So the Zionist forces coating their bullets in pig grease is the perfect image for Zionism. It's perfect because not only is it this sort of imperialist barbarity that goes all the way back to like the revolt that started the first Indian War of Independence, when they were trying to make both Muslim and Hindu soldiers handle cartridges for the rifles that were coated in both cow grease and pig grease. So not only is it a sign of like an arrogant and buffoonish colonial power, it's also a sign of just how far away from the actual Jewish religion Zionism is. And by the way, always was. It was always like the Jewish bourgeoisie going into the realm of fascism, which, of course, bear in mind, one of the ideological founders of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, had already had a failed career as a Christian or a sort of Christian right, pseudo-Christian right politician in Austria-Hungary. He'd already failed to make a career for himself. So part of the reason why he comes up with the doctrines of Zionism is because he'd failed through a degree of anti-Semitism to build himself a career in ultra-reactionary politics in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this is the nominally Jewish soldiers, and of course we don't even know if they are actually Jewish, coating bullets in pig grease is the perfect image for Zionism, not just today but forever. So moving back then to the questions of, well, what effect this has on US imperialism if Israel goes down to a defeat. This is already exacerbating problems, and you can tell that by the severe reaction of the authorities, certainly inside Germany and France, where they're talking about prison sentences for saying things like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, for waving Palestinian flags, for organizing pro-Palestinian demonstrations. There is a Palestinian prisoner solidarity network called Samadoun, which is looking like it's going to be banned or already has been banned in Germany. So this is the kind of severe response, but it happens on everything now. I mean, the bourgeoisies of all the European countries are suffering from a massive crisis of legitimacy and have been for many, many years. It's not just the case that the politicians are unpopular. I mean, it's very rare you actually get popular politicians. It's that the system itself is running out of juice. And the only tool that they will reach for is repression. That's what they will always reach for. I mean, look back over just the last few years. Let's look back to 2020 and COVID. What was their response to that? Well, their response was to transfer gigantic amounts of money to Wall Street and the financial sector, and then later on through the vaccine thing to the pharmaceutical companies. And their response was to threaten anybody who disobeyed the supposed health guidelines, which have nothing to do with health, with large amounts of time in prison. And the question, of course, we looked at this at the time on the podcast, which is, well, why on earth is this the way to go? And the answer is that this is the way the machine is set up in not just Britain and the United States, but certainly France and Germany are proving to be even more repressive than Britain, which is quite some going. The British bourgeoisie, or at least the state bureaucracy, at the moment seems to have rode back from the sort of bitter threats of Suella Braverman. I think it's also the fact that the British bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, certain elements of it in the Home Office do not like the current Home Secretary and wish to see her gone. And so therefore, due to this inner governmental bureaucratic rivalry and bitch fighting, you're seeing, I think, Braverman's directives get dropped or watered down. Also, I think some people in the police and intelligence hierarchy have assessed when it's worth having a fight and decided that this isn't worth having a fight over. Germany, however, is going full light-blooded Prussian anti-socialist law era repression. And this was true in COVID as well. There was the case of I think he's an American writer and satirist, a guy called C.J. Hopkins, who was taken to court and threatened with jail time over a cartoon that was on the front cover of his book that was about COVID. So this is deep-rooted. I mean, bear in mind also whether the roots of the modern German state, the modern German bourgeois state, aren't just in, of course, the Federal Republic of Germany. The roots of that are in the administrative and bureaucratic machine of the Third Reich. That's who was building the Federal Republic of Germany. They got some people who used to be dissenters or exiles to front it up. But the bureaucratic machine, the military machine, the intelligence machine, all came from the Third Reich. As the argument went from the US and the British at the time that of the Nuremberg trials, the Soviets wanted to prosecute more of the middle-ranking guys who actually did a lot of the work to implement the directives of the Nazis. And the Americans and the British, of course, refused to do so, arguing that they needed those men to rebuild the German state. And indeed they did. And, of course, its earlier predecessor was the old, very repressive Prussian state. Now you might say, well, what relevance does that have? But the administrative and bureaucratic legacies do survive in one form or another. The tendency towards massive repression survives, but also the nature of the German ruling class survives. It's altered through class struggle, but at the moment its system is pitching into crisis, and so the always incredibly repressive machine that the Federal Republic of Germany always had at its disposal and imposed upon what is occupied East Germany has, of course, returned with a vengeance over the last few years as German capitalism's crisis has increased. The only thing the bourgeoisie know how to do is to reach for the policeman's baton and batter people. And, of course, then you get all these ludicrous, like, right-wing hacks and opportunists going around saying, oh, it's because of immigration. No, it's because of the state of German capitalism. That's why it's always reaching for the policeman's baton or the gun if things get more severe. The French are the same. The French state has always been incredibly repressive. By the way, all of this applies to the British state as well. I'm just using France and Germany as an example because, of course, the French state under de Gaulle was designed to be very repressive. It was designed to have almost monarchical level powers for the presidency. It was designed to have a national assembly that was very, very weak, that the president could easily get around and overrule if he possibly wanted to. And Macron has continued all those traditions as French capitalism is very much in an even deeper crisis than German capitalism now. And you can tell that because they're being forced out of West Africa. It's very appropriate today that we should, of course, salute the memory of the great Thomas Sankara, a man who French imperialism in the form of the Nazi collaborator, François Mitterrand, of course. Let's remember how he got his career started, which is, of course, working as an official in the Vichy government, and later on went on to become president, backed fully by the revisionist French Communist Party, by the way, for the first few years, and, of course, capitulated even on the reformist elements in his program and oversaw a wholesale attack on the French working class throughout the 1980s, with the full and active collaboration, of course, of the Gaullists led by a certain Jacques Chirac at the time. Mitterrand, of course, conspired with the Comprador elements and the traitors inside Burkina Faso, led by Blaise Compaoré, to have Sankara murdered. But, of course, the ultimate revenge is that the spirit of Sankara illuminates and powers the revolutionary process inside Burkina Faso today, and also has direct inspiration in Mali and Niger, where the French influence is being removed. So if you look into, and we did live streams on this, all of the massive advantages that French imperialism still got from its neo-colonial rule over Mali and Niger in particular, in the form of the uranium concessions they had there, and also gold mining and other important natural resources that French imperialism was looting out of those countries, losing access to that bit by bit by bit, is going to have a devastating impact. And of course, what does the French ruling class do to suppress the contradictions that its business model is creating inside its own country? Because, of course, part of the neo-colonial model is mass migration out of the dominated neo-colonial countries into the French mainland to work as cheap labor. And of course, when these people are forced into negative living conditions and they are subject to the extremely violent militarized policing of the extremely racist and extremely reactionary French police, there is a revolt. And what is the response of the French ruling class? Further repression. What is the response of the French ruling class towards the Gilets jaunes? Further repression, including killing quite a number of people. I don't have the precise number to hand right now, but I think I need to return to this in future broadcasts, because a number of people were killed, beaten to death, died through injury sustained from the firing of solid metal slugs coated in plastic or coated in rubber at people's heads. People's eyes got blown out. What happened to the Yellow Vest movement was a massive act of repression from the French state, so that the French and German states turned to this brutish repression when faced with pro-Palestinian protests shouldn't really be a surprise. The British state will do it too if they calculate that they're being a problem. The British, though, have a history of being a little more tricky when it comes to state repression. Of course, they're not afraid of using it when their interests dictate, but they're a little cleverer when it comes to allowing a protest to pass without incident if they calculate that it's better to let it have its day out, have it march around, and then seek to try and move the agenda on so that the issue gets glossed over. They will, of course, use the full repressive machinery of the state if they feel they have to, but they would rather the safety valves be left in place to a degree. Of course, they've got a whole raft of repressive legislation, anti-terror legislation, so-called, various other measures. They've always had the ability to launch a vast clampdown on democratic rights, such as those that do exist in this country, by even before we look at all the terrorism acts, which can define terrorism, by the way, as literally anything. They could always institute a reign of public emergency by just simply invoking a thing called the Defence of the Realm Act, which gives the government blanket powers in the event that they see a threat to the state, or literally the defence of the king's realm. So there's a whole range of legislation that they could use to ban any demonstration, arrest anybody at any time. Most of the time, though, they use it in a targeted fashion. If, for instance, we were talking last night about the need to build an anti-imperialist movement, if that starts happening, then you'll see the British government really go to war and seek to clamp down upon that before it gets any bigger. They certainly don't want the relationship that they have with the US imperialists to be fully publicized before the eyes of the working class and have everybody be made aware of the implications of it. And so we return to the question then, what effect will the defeat of Israel have? Now, again, one of the reasons why they are so attached to the Israeli colonial project, it's not even a neo-colonial project, it's a direct colonial project, which is principally being run by US imperialism, but all the others are being pulled in behind it, is that this is really the last stand for colonialism. It's the last colonial enterprise that exists from that period, because it came into existence and it has never fully succeeded in getting what it wants or getting what it needs, which is, of course, the mass expulsion of or enslavement of or the murder of the subjugated native population. The resistance of the Palestinians has always been too strong for them to fully be able to do that, and remains too strong to this day. Its fate is sealed. It's just a question of when. And so with the failure of and the collapse of the last colonial project, the blowback inside the US imperialist bloc, I think, is going to be significant. Because, for a start, you have inside Israel right now 300,000 at least dual nationals who are dual nationals of Israel and the United States. Now, many of them are the most fanatical and the most well-financed Zionist settlers, and the most dangerous, the most heavily armed, and the most motivated. If we get to the point where the Zionist state starts collapsing or has to sign some kind of surrender deal or even a two-state solution, some of those people will try and start a civil war, try and start terrorism. Others of them will return embittered to their homeland. And God knows what kind of problems that those guys could create. Perhaps they'll go to work for the American state, though. That's usually what happens. And more than that, I think the effect of the defeat of Israel would be a shattering blow to the arrogant overconfidence of the US political class. You know, morons like Brian Mast stood in the halls of Congress in the Israeli army uniform. They've convinced themselves that as an extension of their power, Israel is immortal. Well, if Israel is defeated, they know very well, and these fools inside the US Congress will finally be brought face to face with the truth that not only has their army lost in Afghanistan, then their colonial project is losing. If If you notice that one of the things that keeps popping up is that the sons and daughters of the U.S. political and media elite are often off fighting somewhere. Remember that utter stooge Robert Kennedy Jr. said that his son had gone and fought in Ukraine. David Brooks, this ridiculous columnist for the New York Times, declared that his son was off fighting in the IDF. You get it a lot with the sort of elite tier politicians and journalists, that various relatives of theirs either are serving or have served, or they've gone over on for IDF safari themselves. There's a famous example that is always cited of the editor of the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, who volunteered for the IDF and became a prison guard and wrote about his experience torturing Palestinian prisoners. They go over there to essentially, if we're moving now into psychoanalytic territory perhaps a little bit, but they go over there to enact their worst and most depraved fantasies, I think. They go over there to essentially enact the things that they would probably want to do inside the continental United States, but perhaps can't do for various different reasons, or don't feel they can do. But they feel like they can go over to occupied Palestine and essentially act like the French colonial army did in Algeria. There, they can go over there, they can torture, they can murder with impunity and claim that they felt threatened somehow. They can do all the horrendous things that a colonial occupying army does, which, by the way, the US Army does. But they can do so for a short period of time and with even less accountability than comes for the United States Army. And that's not very much. They can do anything, they feel, to the figure of the Palestinian native and get away with it. And so to see this colonial project turn in on itself and either get defeated or implode, that's going to have a huge impact inside the United States itself. And for that reason, I say that I would say that any US communist, I'm sure the majority who are aware of this program and are watching it will agree with this, should welcome the defeat of the Zionist state and its implosion and the implementation of a one-state solution. The only way that truly that there is a way forward for the collective working class of the region is in a one-state solution. Two-state solution is a complete non-starter. You're never going to get these fanatics to go along with that. It has to be the end of the Zionist project. It seems to be more difficult, but in actual fact it is the only road forward. But again, the impact of this defeat on the US imperialist politicians and their power structures will be enormous. So it'll be an enormous psychological blow to their image of themselves, and it will, of course, have a reflection back into the United States. Think of how many US police departments send their reactionary knuckle draggers who are in their police departments down to over to Israel for a training course. Think of how many go through training courses with the Israeli army to learn the techniques for anti-terrorism. It's no coincidence that they do that, by the way. Ultimately, they're going to try and impose all the different ways in which the Palestinian population was micromanaged and micro-repressed by the Israeli armed forces and the settlers. They're going to try and do that to the most subjugated parts of the US working class as well. That's what they're going to try and do, if not a direct lift from these the circumstances in the West Bank. And certainly they're taking a lot of inspiration from it. You only need to look at how extremely militarized most of the US police forces are. Same is true, by the way, in France and Germany. They all send people to Israel for training because they see there, or at least they did until recently, how successful the Israelis had been at using various high-tech methods of repression, it seemed, breaking the will to fight of the Palestinian population. Oh, how wrong they were. But again, seeing this all fail and publicly fail, the great high-tech repressive state of the Zionist forces is really going to have it's going to deal a hammer blow to the US imperialists in particular, but the wider imperialist bloc as well. So for all these reasons, we should stand in solidarity with the Palestinian national liberation fight and be prepared for the knockback into our own countries when the eventual defeat of the Zionist state does come around. The other thing I wanted to mention tonight in the last few minutes was that the government led by Duda and Morawiecki in Poland appears to have lost its election. Now, at the moment, both they and the so-called opposition leader, though he's not really that much of an opposition, Donald Tusk, are both claiming that they can form a government, but the forces that are available to Tusk as the opposition leader upon the exit poll that I've seen seem to be larger. Now, I'm going to cover this in more depth tomorrow. In terms of potential significance for the Ukraine war, I don't see it being that much of a change. It may give the polls the opportunity to further distance themselves. Tusk, though, of course, is a former president of the European Commission. He's a diehard pro-US liberal, whereas, of course, Morawiecki and Duda, whereas they were very much in the pocket of the US, also were running this kind of nationalistic project which put them at odds, particularly with the Germans. So in many ways, the victory of Tusk, if indeed he does put together a government, will actually temporarily reinforce the Polish policy when it comes to Ukraine. He may even drop the distancing that Duda and Morawiecki did. Who knows? Politicians in most European countries are nothing if not entirely opportunistic. But also it means that the friction between the Poles and the Germans will recede a little bit, which is probably good news for the German bourgeoisie and the German political class who are looking to stabilize the EU project. If Morawiecki and Duda had won, then likely they would have brought back up the German reparations question and a whole range of other things. We'll see. I'll know more about this when I've been able to analyze the results tomorrow. Okay, so good evening to everybody who's been in the discussion group tonight. Just going to be going for an hour tonight. Hello to Philippos Kasapis. Apparently the Communist Party won 6 local elections in Greece tonight. Interesting development. Hello to Zim Left Radio. Hello to Gabriel Perez. Hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Hello to Randy, Martin Fanukin, Ben, Yuan, Peter, my fellow resident of Perfidious Albion, Heidi and Tusker, and my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. And also good evening to President Jesus, Burke, James Graham and Muniz. Peter says, perhaps terrorism is aptly described as whatever dissent the warring, plundering, and therefore guiltily paranoid imperialist class is currently the most terrified of. That could be one definition. It might be the only one that's worth having, actually. Big Meanie says, speaking of US police forces trained in Israel, New York City Police has actual offices in Israel. Well, I suppose that fits given how many of the dual citizens and settlers are from New York. I mean, that's where, of course, the mass murderer Benjamin Goldstein came from. So I guess it fits that they have offices over there. This is the origin of the US police tactic of throwing people on the ground. Yeah. The notorious tactic of... Is that where they got the chokehold from, or did they get that out from elsewhere? But certainly the Israel serves as a laboratory for all the most violent, like brutal tactics that certainly the US police force can come up with. Israel is the spot where they go to gin up on those. So losing that would be an incredibly positive thing for workers inside the United States. It would really offend the reactionary sensibilities if Israel went down. So, right, just going to do an hour tonight because I've got to be up in the morning. I'm going to be back in the usual time slot tomorrow of 10 to 11. Look out for the audio for this going up on Patreon, which it will go up immediately after we've closed this down. So, thank you to everybody who's contributed to the chat this evening. I will, though, leave you with one piece of business which you should be aware of. YouTube has now completely demonetized this channel. I'm switching off. I've switched off already monetization on the videos. YouTube sent me a notification this morning saying that now they were removing the ability of people to take out memberships on this channel. So be aware of that. Don't take one out. If you've taken one out already, I can only apologize because YouTube has made it so that whatever money you've put into it I can't get access to. So the channel has been essentially denied monetization for a variety of reasons, it would seem. Perhaps the final straw for Google was me doing these programs on Palestine. They also sent me a notification that they would not be monetizing videos that either made light of or misrepresented the events in Ukraine. Well, that's basically the entire channel. So if you see any ads on any videos, these aren't things that I am benefiting from in the slightest. So feel free to use the most powerful ad blocker you possibly can on that. Alternatively, you can, of course, go across to Odyssey and the page there, where, of course, you can find everything without ads. And if you want to support this program and the projects that I'm involved in here, that I'm trying to build up, then go over to Patreon and select a subscription tier there. That's the best way to do it. So far, I'm not having any problems with that. But apparently, a combination of pro-Russian and pro-Palestinian content is just too much for the masters of Google. I suspect also that somebody probably reported the channel. So, thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon, by the way. Couldn't do it without you. Be sure to submit your questions for the Patreon live stream Q&A coming up at the end of the month. Okay, so until tomorrow, thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Be back with you again then, and I'll switch you over to our appropriate holding screen.